So let's argue against the cosmological argument for God. Okay, Bertrand Russell, following Hume, makes an argument that we put too much together, that the universe, contingent beings, are just there. That's all. They didn't come into being. They're not going to go out of being. That it's just a matter of their existence. You see, Russell and Hume, they say that we group things together that are not intended to be grouped together. Let's say, to know that a rubber ball dropped on a Tuesday in Wagner Hall by a red-headed tuba player and that it will fall to the ground, it does not mean that you have to go find tuba players that are red-headed. It does not mean that you have to run tests. We recognize that balls fall to the ground regardless of who drops them. So grouping all of it together to prove or to falsify the statement about the rubber ball is to miss the point. One does not need to group everything together. So Russell says that just because we see the universe as a whole does not mean that it is contingent and part of itself. This is the logical fallacy of composition, which is assuming that parts that have a certain property will always have that same property, and that those parts go together as a full set. So, as we continue to think about that, right, the idea of a fallacy of composition is the same idea that if all the bricks in the wall are small, then that means the wall is small. That the parts composed together impact the outcome. You could also take the same idea as that a wall is brick because it is built of bricks. Maybe. But what's inside of it, we may not know. Do we know everything? So, when we talk about things as those who believe in God, we recognize that the universe, including matter and energy, did not exist at some point and exists now. And as we look into the telescope through astronomy, we recognize that the universe at some point will not exist. So these are the definitions of a contingent being, that the universe did not exist at some point, that it will not exist at some point, and that it exists now. So it's important also here to address the issue of a principle of sufficient reason. A principle of sufficient reason, it's a logical piece that helps us understand that we have to explain why the cause had the effect that it did and not a different effect. So this plays into the cosmological argument for God, because we could say that what if the unmoved mover created numerous universes? Or why did the unmoved mover create this universe? Why did the unmoved mover create at all? So sometimes with the principle of sufficient reason, we assume that the sufficient reason becomes deterministic, meaning that God can do no other than create the universe. But you have to look at it differently and recognize that just because we can establish that God created this religion or this universe does not mean that at the point God couldn't have decided to create other universes. But because God chose this universe, it doesn't remove freedom from God, but instead we're just telling the story of what God did. So we recognize that God was drawn to creating the universe, that God chose to create the universe, and that as the unmoved mover, it explains not that God wouldn't have done other things, but that God did do this thing. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion of the weaknesses of the cosmological argument of God, and also discussion of the principle of sufficient reason.